Bom dia. Good morning. Welcome to the first session of the second day of the Interdisciplining Knowledge Symposium. Bom dia a todos, bem-vindos ao segundo dia do simpósio Interdisciplinando o Conhecimento. Apesar da nossa mesa ser toda lusofalante, nós vamos mudar para inglês para enquadrar todos os participantes no simpósio. Although we are all the Portuguese speakers, we are simply this follow us. It has been a pleasure to be among such interesting colleagues and enjoy their shared thoughts and concerns. Interdisciplinary, this must be dialogue. I believe that we are being successful in the course of dialogue that we have initiated here. Personally, I relate the practice of interdisciplinarity with a particular term, which is not an emotion but a faculty, which is empathy. Empathy describes, in simple terms, the ability to understand the positions, feelings, and values of others, always preserving our own integrity. This understanding, this point of encounter or articulation, following fundamental concepts of society, gives rise to new meanings. Interdisciplinarity, in order to be fair and productive, must necessarily be empathetic, rooted in deep understanding of others' worldview, preserving our own worldview. This session encompasses interdisciplinary performativity, reflecting on what counts as interdisciplinary work, how projects are shaped, policies are drafted, and programs are completed. The purpose of this session emerges as the common axis, a proposal for understanding and interpretation of knowledge that goes beyond the traditional disciplinary framework, including regimes of knowledge production that usually rest outside the spectrum of science. Let's start with Lynn Mario de Souza. Lynn is a senior professor of English at the University of São Paulo. Lynn developed reflection around the topics of impact assessment, interdisciplinary research, collaborative excellence, and interdisciplinary collaboration among practitioners. Today is going to present the paper Short Significant Knowledge, the Case of Anaconda.
Thank you very much. Bom, eu queria começar agradecendo o convite do colega do José, da Olga. So now I can switch to English. Quero agradecer. Okay, so just as we don't have very much time, so basically what I'm trying to say, and I'd like to make my words the words of our colleague who introduced this session, but empathy and dialogue are extremely important in interdisciplinary research. And so when empathy and dialogue come in, they come in terms of the attitude and ethic of whoever is doing interdisciplinary research. So that it's not enough to talk about interdisciplinary research as if it's a content or a discipline, because otherwise we're going to go back into our disciplinary ideologies of knowledge as complete and knowledge as pre-existing us. So for me, a dialogic perspective, and here I refer to the work of Voloshinov and Bakhtin, Dialogue is always incomplete, ongoing, and it always involves experience, lived experience. So it's always political, always ideological. And here I just want to give you an example of what I'm talking about. It's research that I did with a community, an indigenous community in northwestern Brazil, in the extreme west of the Amazon, on the borders of Bolivia. And so basically, what I'm saying is the important element which is in all disciplinarity is whoever is doing this interdisciplinarity, the attitude and the ethic of the doer of interdisciplinarity. And I think this is important in a session we're talking about formativities, where the doing is important. Okay, so here I'm using this term, entering the community quietly. This is I referred in one of my previous publications to the work of get his first name, Kenneth Fife, the linguist, who was also a member of the what was it called? The linguist SIL, and the SIL. These acronyms, I never remember what they are, but they stand somewhere Institute of Linguistics, which was a very, it was a very missionary and colonial institution, and it was very active in Brazil, especially in this region that I'm talking about. And I looked into one of their manuals of instructing future, they employed linguists to work as missionaries in the field. And in one of their instruction manuals for linguists and missionaries, there's this phrase written by Kenneth Fife: you have to enter a community quietly, right? I mean, this could be something written by the CIA, right? So there's this political attitudinal aspect to it, ideological aspect to it, which is very important. So very important when I said who is doing it, so I have to say who I am when I'm talking about this, because this made a lot of difference to what I encountered in this community. So I'm a linguist, and I went there with two other linguist colleagues. But the difference was the two colleagues, which were from neighboring universities to me in São Paulo. São Paulo is the rich southeast part of the country, the white, rich southeast part of the country. When I say white, I mean it doesn't reflect the demographic, the national demographic of Brazil, which is 57% of non-whites. If you look at São Paulo, it would probably be the same percentage of whites. Right? That's where I'm speaking from that perspective. São Paulo especially is European immigrant descent from European immigrants. Lots of people have a second passport, Italian, Portuguese, German, whatever, Japanese. So my two linguistic colleague friends were part of this inheritance. I wasn't. I emigrated to Brazil when I was 21. I have 4 nationalities. None of the 4 are Brazilian, because if I become Brazilians, I have a right to. I've lived in Brazil for 50 years. I have to abandon my 4 other nationalities. So, being a civil servant in Brazil, I have most of the rights of a citizen, except I can't vote. But in the position that I am as a professor, I can influence people. Okay. So we were sent, this was in the early 90s, me and my colleagues, we were sent, like other linguists, to various parts of the country, because the recent constitution of Brazil in 1988, for the first time in 500 years of the existence of Brazil, recognized the existence of indigenous cultures and languages. For the first time, this is the post-dictatorship constitution. And in the constitution it says that all indigenous communities have a right to education in their own languages and their own cultures. Right? It looks very liberatory, but in fact it isn't, because what languages and cultures in education mean, they can be very different things for people who come from an urban literate community and for people who come from an agraphic community, not rather than using the word illiterate. Okay, so the objective was, the result was they had a right to schools, public schools in each community. Now the problem is that indigenous communities, here we're talking about the Amazon, so these are indigenous communities that survived 500 years of colonization. These communities tend to be small. The largest are in fact in the municipality of São Paulo, our largest city, and they are around 800 inhabitants. But in the Amazon, the general size of indigenous community is about 200. Some are 400, some are 500, but normally around 200. Now, if each community has its right to its own school, its own language, you can imagine how expensive it is going to be to produce teaching materials for each community, right? So that's where the concept of language becomes very important. Do these people actually have their own language? Does each community have its own language, or does the whole region share the same language? See, this is our concept, our urban concept of language, which is connected to a national territory, which conflicts with another relationship to the land, which is the indigenous relationship to the land, right? So you who live on that land are very much connected to that land. So your language is the language of that land. Another community has a different relationship to their land, they have a different language. But as linguists, we were sent by our Ministry of Education. Indirectly, no one actually said this to us, but it was between the lines that we had to convince them that they spoke the same language in various communities along the same river. Now this is, and here I want to say how this is the lack of interdisciplinary sensitivity, or the lack of intercultural sensitivity. I make a parallel between the two, interculturality and interdisciplinarity. So we had no idea, we, the government, we, the academics in the elite universities of the Southeast, we, the linguists who should have this sensitivity, we had no idea of the anthropological constitution of these communities. We had no idea what an exogamous community does, believes in. So it's very important for me to say where I'm speaking from, because I have personally, I have all of this, I have a lived experience of interculturality. So I'm sensitive to cultural difference in a different way that my other colleagues who are equally linguists to me, but they may not have the same intercultural sensitivities or sensibilities. Okay, so what we didn't know was that these communities were exogamic. Now, what does this mean? We heard about this yesterday. Exogamic basically means they have to marry outside. So they have to marry from people from the other village downriver. Now, to be able to marry from the other village downriver, that community, you cannot have any blood or familial relationship with that community. They have to be outsiders, right? So they cannot speak the same language. This is how this challenges our concepts of Western linguistics. And it's an absurdity trying to convince them that they speak the same language. We would end up affecting their marriage practices, right? But the fact that they're exogamous also permitted them, gave them a privilege over our own attitudes. Because being exogamous, I'm going to talk about this is where the anaconda comes in. Being exogamous in their cultures, they share, this community, I didn't say what they're called the Kashinawa, or the Hunikui, because their names, Kashinawa was a name given by the Portuguese colonizers to them. The name that they referred to themselves is Hunikui. Kashinawa means the people of the bats. This is the colonizing name for them. Okay, so these people, because they're exogamous, they have the cultural concept of the cunhado, what they call child in their language, the brother-in-law. Now, you make the connection between being exogamous and a brother-in-law. A brother-in-law is someone who comes from another community. Right? So brothers-in-law, or people who don't belong to a community, they come from another community, which means they may have different cultural traditions, and they may definitely have a different language. No, maybe us as linguists wouldn't call it a different language, but they do. Right? And it's the brother-in-law is an outsider. So the way they deal with outsiders is in terms of tribe, which is the brother-in-law, who is commensal outside in anthropological terms, meaning someone you can marry, someone you can invite to a meal with you. So it's an outsider, but an outsider that doesn't threaten your existence. Very different to the concept of a white. When I say a white, they mean a colonist. You don't have to be literally white to be a colonist. What they call the white, branco. The white is the radical other. The radical other is the other that threatens your existence, who you wouldn't invite to have a sit down and have a meal with, who you wouldn't invite, you would certainly never invite to be your brother. So they have two different concepts of alterity. You have one from outside, downriver, and the radical other who threatens your existence. So when the three of us, me and my two female colleagues, as linguists, we went into this community, we were received differently. They looked at me and the first thing they said, right? They identified with me as being not a white, right? So they kind of put me in their cultural terms as being a child, a brother-in-law. So I wasn't a threat to them. But my two white colleagues were. Right? We didn't understand this at the time. It took us some time to understand this. Okay, so what happened there? Before I go there and say what happened there, I'd like to say a little bit about disciplinary attitudes and what how this affected us. So we went there as linguists, which means we looked at language and literacy as dialogic and social. But we, as linguists, we also have this idea, this preconceived disciplinary idea that language is essentially oral, and written language is a portrayal, a representation of the oral. We have this idea that we inherited from this logocentric idea that we inherited from the Greeks, that meaning appears first in the mind, then it's expressed through speech, and writing represents speech. So speech is a primary representation of language, and writing is a secondary representation of language, right? So that's why Socrates and Plato, for example, were against writing, because writing is very different from the mind. The mind is embodied, whereas writing isn't. So writing can't guarantee meaning, because it can be decontextualized. They were speaking from a concept of orality. Right? So these were logocentrism and formocentrism, meaning writing is representation of speech, what we as linguists were trained. So that was our knowledge about speech writing was what was natural to us. But we were also sent as specialists in literacy. And literacy, within literacy, we have this idea of language which conflicts with linguistics. It says literacy is a social practice. We get this from Brian Creek, and then other people have to come after. But still, literacy is primarily alphabetic, and the visual in literacy is always secondary, it's supplementary. And we have a plurality of literacy practices. This is what we believe in literacy theory. So each community can have its own literacy practices, or within each community you can have different genres of writing. Right? So we have this concept of plurality, which isn't, for me, it's not very well thought through what plurality means. So, but the basic concept that is in the disciplines that plurality means 1 + 1 + 1 + 1. It's an additive concept of plurality. Right? There is another concept of plurality, which is multiplication, holistic. Right? What is that? That is 1 times 1 times 1. So 1 plus 1 gives you 3. 1 times 1 times 1, the multiplication concept, gives you 1. Right? So plurality in a holistic sense contributes to the change, to a collective sense of change. Whereas in the additive sense, it doesn't contribute to this sense of change. So that's where we ran into problems. Okay, so I'm going to show you some of my data. Before I go into the data, we had in our political concept, we have this concept, and here how our political ideological, and here I'm speaking of politics as being structural, and ideology as being structural. It's not something you may be aware of, but you grow into. And this is what Paulo Freire talks about. Where is that? Paulo Freire talks about how we are born into our social ways of thinking when he says, antes de ser o eu de mim mesmo, fui o você de outro. This is just to say that even when we're speaking as an individual I, an individual subject, we're always collectively constructed. Okay? So, just again to exemplify this before I show you my data, and then I'm going to stop. What do we mean by this? I'm sorry to my data here. I'm looking at things which are culturally based and they're in Portuguese. You people are not familiar with Brazil. This is language, it's Portuguese, written in Portuguese, but would you understand what this is? It's expressamente proibida a entrada de verde. If you're from São Paulo, this is a football stadium, which is the team of Corinthians, which is has its uniform in black, basically black and white. Their symbolic colors is black, and they are rivals of another team from São Paulo, which is called Palmeiras, which is green. Right? So I mean, it's no good just understanding the language. This is the dialogic concept of language. So you bring meaning to language. Meaning does not emanate from language. This is the importance of who is reading, right? So we complete language. It's not just there. Like disciplines are not just there. It depends on who is doing the discipline. And there you see a representation that it goes so far, this ideology of not wanting green, but even their artificial grass, one of their practicing is black. And then at the bottom example again of the lack of what happens when you lack dialogism and you believe that meaning is in language. If you put into Google Translator, this was in our last election, a headline from a newspaper, Lula cai no Rio, right? And this is what you get. Lula is president, was a candidate at the time. Rio is a city, but it literally means river, and Lula literally means squid. So that's what you get. Right? So if you talk about, if you think of want to do interdisciplinarity as if the values of the discipline emanate from the discipline, this is what you get. So if you want to do interdisciplinarity, taking account of what you are bringing to the discipline, you have something very different. Okay, so I'll just end here with this is what we took to our I wasn't familiar with this, my colleagues took it, so we weren't racist, but we were part of Brazilian culture. And this is very strong in Brazilian culture. It gives us the image of our Indian. And this is Pedro Magalhães, the girl who wrote in 1570 when he encountered the Tupinamba indigenous language. So não se acha nela F nem L nem R, coisa digna de espanto. Pois assim não tem fé, nem lei, nem rei. E desta maneira vivem sem justiça, desordenadamente. Again, what he's interpreting it literally. He's interpreting the other literally. If they don't have the letters, these letters in their language, or these sounds in their language, they don't have faith, they don't have law, they don't have a king. This is what the Portuguese have when they colonized Brazil. Right? Meaning these people have no system, they have no culture, they have nothing that's worth of any social or cultural value. This is very strong and underlies the Brazilian concept of the Indian. We took this with us. Okay, and I'm not going to analyze these, I'm just going to show you what we found. This is the data, then you can think about it for yourself. When we were teaching them Portuguese and writing in Portuguese, what they came back with in the classroom, these were adults. We taught them the alphabetic writing, we taught them Portuguese, they had a rudimentary Portuguese. But instead of writing texts, this is what they produce. These are different texts. And what do you see here? They're using visuality, right? More, they're inverting the logic of literacy that we experts of literacy have, which is the visual is secondary to the written. Here, what strikes us immediately is the visuality, and the written is a very small, sometimes not even existent, right? It made no sense to us. We had to make a huge effort to try and understand this. Now, I, as a field linguist and with my intercultural experience, you know, when I come across something that I don't understand, I feel, okay, it's my ignorance, right? There's something that I don't understand. It's not a deficiency of the other. Right? But my two other colleagues as linguists, they said, oh, well, these people are capable of understanding writing. Right? And then what comes in? The generic Indian idea. Oh, são crianças, são infantis, daqui a pouco vão aprender a escrever. They're children, right? Immediately, this is how the racism idea comes in. They're primitive, they're children, they're infantile. This is what children do. They draw before they learn to write. You see the attitudinal aspect of the outsider interacting. Now, what you see, which is common, and then my linguist, it may look like I'm not trying to say that I was better than my colleagues. What I'm saying is that my life experience put me, okay. So just look at the anaconda. This is the anaconda skin. Now the anaconda, can you see the geometric designs all over are the anaconda skin? Because this is a community of ayahuasca, meaning vision. They get their knowledge from vision, not from hearing. So knowledge comes not from the mind and then represented through orality and then represented in writing. Knowledge comes from vision, and writing represents vision. Stop that.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry to.
No, sorry, I'm sorry to go on long. Yeah.
Now we are going to Coelho. Carolina is an architect, graduating from the Department of Architecture beyond Coimbra. Currently, she creates the intervention and research project team from the University of Coimbra of the Council Secondary School in Coimbra, developing participatory approaches to school agility. Today, she's presenting bridging people, school, and academia, the core project. That's all.
Good morning. So I'll start